I warned my boss that someone was stealing $65 million from our company. He looked me straight in the eyes, thanked me for bringing it to his attention, and 5 days later I was sitting in HR being fired for something I never did. My name is Hadley, and before that day I had spent 6 years building my career inside the company. I was 29 years old, careful with numbers, loyal to my work, and proud of the trust I'd earned. I wasn't searching for a scandal. I wasn't trying to expose anyone. I was simply doing my job. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing vendor payments when one invoice caught my attention. $2.3 million. The payment had gone to a company called Prestwick Freight Solutions. According to our records, they handled overflow shipping for some of our biggest clients. But when I searched for them, almost nothing came up. No proper office. No clear business registration. No real history. Just a name receiving millions from our company. I stared at that invoice for several minutes, hoping I'd find an innocent explanation. Instead, I found something much worse. That single payment was only the beginning. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about Prestwick Freight Solutions. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, made myself a coffee, closed my office door, and started digging through the vendor records. At first, I only looked at payments connected to Prestwick. Then I found another one. And another. Soon I had a spreadsheet covering more than 3 years of transactions. There were 214 separate payments. None of them looked shocking on their own. Most were large, but not large enough to immediately trigger an automatic audit. They were scattered across different months, different projects, and different client accounts. But when I added them together, I froze. The total was over $61 million. I stared at the number on my screen, convinced I'd made a mistake. So I checked it again. Then again. The number didn't change. My hands actually started shaking. I kept digging because I needed to know whether Prestwick was the only problem. It wasn't. I found 2 other vendors receiving payments through the exact same routing information. Different names. Different invoices. Same financial trail. That was when I stopped thinking this was an accounting mistake. Someone had built a system. Someone had been moving money out of the company for years, carefully breaking the payments into amounts that wouldn't attract immediate attention. And someone inside the company had to know. I printed everything and took it to my supervisor, Priya. The moment she saw the numbers, the color drained from her face. She didn't ask me why I had been investigating. She didn't accuse me of misunderstanding the records. She simply closed the office door. Hadley, you need to take this to Grantham. My stomach tightened at the name. Grantham personally oversaw our biggest vendor relationships. He was also the man who had hired me 6 years earlier. I still remembered what he told me during my first week. People who care about the details are the people who protect this company. I believed him. Priya told me this was far beyond anything she could handle and that I needed to go directly to him. That night I barely slept. I kept opening the spreadsheet, checking the formulas, checking the invoices, checking the vendor information. I wanted desperately to discover that I had misunderstood everything. But every time I checked, the evidence became clearer. By morning, I knew I had only 2 choices. Stay quiet and pretend I never saw it. Or walk into my boss's office and tell him that someone had stolen tens of millions of dollars from the company. I chose the second. I just didn't know yet that it would cost me my job. I still remember what I wore that morning. A gray blazer my mother had bought me after my first promotion. I used to call it my lucky blazer. That morning I needed all the luck I could get. I stood outside Grantham's office with a physical folder pressed against my chest. I had copies of every invoice, every payment record, every vendor detail, and every connection I'd discovered. I could have sent everything through email, but something inside me told me not to. I wanted proof in my hands. I knocked. Come in. Grantham looked up from his desk and smiled. Hadley. What's going on? I need about 15 minutes. He checked his calendar and nodded. You've got 20. I closed the door behind me and sat across from him. For the first few minutes I explained what I had found. Then I opened the folder. I showed him Prestwick. Then the 214 payments. Then the $61 million total. Then the 2 other vendors connected to the same routing information. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. He leaned forward and studied the documents carefully. Are you absolutely sure about these numbers? I checked them several times. He asked sharp questions. Where did I find the records? Who had access? How long had the payments been happening? Had I told anyone else? I answered every question honestly. Finally, he leaned back. Hadley, this is serious. I nodded. I know. He thanked me for catching it. He told me he would immediately involve legal and internal audit. Then he asked me to keep everything confidential while they investigated. I walked out of that office feeling strangely relieved. For the first time since discovering the fraud, I believed I had done the right thing. I believed my boss was going to protect the company. I believed the truth would matter. For 4 days nothing happened. No questions from legal. No meeting with internal audit. No request for additional documents. Still, I told myself investigations took time. Then, on the 5th day, everything changed. An email appeared on my calendar. Mandatory HR meeting. No explanation. I walked into a conference room expecting questions about the fraud. Instead, a lawyer named Voss was sitting there with an HR representative I'd never met. Neither of them smiled. Voss opened a folder. Hadley, we're here to discuss some concerns regarding your performance. I stared at him. Performance. 6 years of strong reviews. 6 years of promotions. 6 years without a serious warning. And suddenly I was a problem. As they listed vague accusations I'd never heard before, something inside me went cold. I finally understood. Grantham hadn't been investigating the fraud. He had been investigating me. The hardest part wasn't what Grantham did to me. It was finding out who had helped him. His name was Sawyer. For 4 years, Sawyer had been one of my closest friends at work. We ate lunch together almost every day. He knew about my parents' divorce, my grandmother's health problems, and all the little things I never talked about with anyone else at the office. I trusted him completely. A few days before I officially reported the fraud, Sawyer and I had coffee together. I remember telling him almost casually, I found something strange in the vendor records. I didn't give him details. I didn't mention the $61 million. I didn't tell him I was planning to speak with Grantham. It was simply something I said to a friend. At the time, I never imagined that sentence would come back to hurt me. Months later, after everything had fallen apart, someone from accounting quietly reached out to me. She asked me not to mention her name. Then she told me the truth. Sawyer had gone straight to Grantham that same afternoon. He told him I had found something in the vendor files. He told him I was asking questions. And most importantly, he told Grantham before I had a chance to report anything myself. At first I couldn't believe it. I kept thinking there had to be another explanation. But there wasn't. Sawyer had recently been promoted into a position connected to those same financial records. If the fraud became public, his work could come under investigation too. He was scared. And when he calculated what protecting me might cost him, he decided protecting himself was easier. That was the part that hurt. He wasn't some stranger who had been waiting for a chance to destroy me. He was someone I'd trusted for years. Someone who knew exactly how much this job meant to me. And he still chose silence when it mattered most. By the time I walked into that HR meeting, Grantham had already known about my discovery for days. He had time to prepare. Time to speak with legal. Time to build a story about me. Time to make my accusation look like a personal problem instead of what it really was. I walked into that room believing I was an employee who had discovered fraud. They were treating me like the threat. And suddenly, every strange question Grantham had asked me during our meeting made sense. He hadn't been surprised by my evidence. He had been measuring how much I knew. And while I thought I was giving my boss a chance to fix the problem, he had already started figuring out how to make me disappear. 2 weeks after that HR meeting, I was called into a conference room at exactly 8:47 in the morning. I remember the time because I looked at the clock before I walked inside. Some part of me still believed there had to be a reasonable explanation. There wasn't. A security officer was standing beside the door. That was when my stomach dropped. Grantham wasn't there. Instead, the HR representative sat across from me with Voss beside her. There was a folder on the table already prepared. She took a breath and said, Hadley, your position is being eliminated as part of a restructuring. I stared at her. Restructuring. She nodded. I almost laughed because the company had been hiring people just weeks earlier. Then she told me my system access had already been revoked. My email was gone. My files were locked. My employee badge had been disabled. Everything I had used for 6 years disappeared before I had even finished hearing the explanation. Then came the part that hurt the most. I was given 15 minutes to collect my personal belongings. A box had already been packed at my desk. Already packed. Before I had even entered that room. That one detail told me everything. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't restructuring. They had planned it. I walked back toward my desk with the security officer beside me. The office looked exactly the same as it had every other morning. People were typing. Phones were ringing. Coffee machines were running. But somehow, it felt like I was walking through a place that no longer belonged to me. I passed people I had trained. People whose weddings I had attended. People I had stayed late to help. Most of them suddenly became very interested in their computer screens. Nobody said anything. Then I saw Marlo from compliance. I barely knew her. She looked directly at me. For 2 seconds neither of us spoke. Then she gave me the smallest nod. I didn't understand it at the time. I picked up my box and walked out. When I reached my car, I sat behind the steering wheel in a Target parking lot and just stared ahead. I couldn't drive. I couldn't cry. I couldn't even explain what I was feeling. Eventually the tears came. They came when I smelled the coffee still trapped in my jacket. They came when I saw my mother's name on my phone. And they came hardest when she asked me that evening, "Hadley, what really happened?" I looked at her and finally said the words. I told the truth. Then I realized something. The company hadn't fired me because I was wrong. They fired me because I was right. The hardest part of losing my job wasn't losing the paycheck. It was the silence. For 6 years, those people had been part of my everyday life. I knew their birthdays, their families, their favorite lunch spots, and the problems they were dealing with at home. But after I was fired, it was like I had never existed. Not one person called. Not one person asked if I was okay. Not one person wanted to know what had really happened. I started applying for jobs almost immediately. 63 applications in 2 months. Most never received a response. Twice I made it all the way to the final interview. Both times I felt confident. Then came the same sentence. We decided to move forward with another candidate. I started wondering if someone was quietly damaging my reputation. I couldn't prove it. But every rejection made the thought harder to ignore. My confidence disappeared little by little. I stopped answering calls from unknown numbers because I was afraid they might be another rejection. I stopped talking about work at dinner. I even started questioning myself. What if I had handled everything differently? What if I had stayed quiet? What if I had never opened that invoice? My mother could see what was happening to me. She kept telling me I needed someone to talk to, so eventually I started seeing a therapist. During one session I explained everything from the beginning. The invoice. The vendors. The payments. Grantham. The firing. The silence. She listened carefully and then asked me one simple question. Do you have proof? I told her I had reported everything. She shook her head. That's not what I asked. Do you have copies of the actual documents? I went quiet. Then I remembered. Before my meeting with Grantham, I had saved copies of the records to a personal drive. At the time, I hadn't done it because I expected to be fired. I had done it because I was always careful. I kept backups. I kept receipts. I kept records. That night I opened the drive. 1 folder became 2. Then 5. Invoices. Payment records. Vendor information. Routing details. Internal notes. 3.5 years of financial history. Everything was still there. I sat at my kitchen table until almost 3 in the morning, going through every file. And for the first time since losing my job, something inside me changed. I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong. I stopped wondering whether anyone would believe me. I realized I still had something they couldn't erase. The truth. And now I had the documents to prove it. The next morning I started looking for an attorney. I didn't want just any lawyer. I needed someone who understood financial fraud, whistleblower cases, and what could happen when an employee reported wrongdoing and was fired afterward. After days of searching, I found an attorney named Rosalind 2 towns away. I almost canceled the appointment twice. I was terrified she would look at my documents, tell me I had misunderstood everything and send me home with nothing. Instead she listened. For nearly 2 hours I told her everything. She didn't interrupt. She didn't tell me I was being dramatic. She didn't ask why I had trusted Grantham. She simply turned the pages and made notes. When I finally finished, she looked at the first group of documents again. Then she looked at me. Hadley, this is serious. I nodded. I know. She spent the next 2 days reviewing everything. On the third day, she called me into her office. She had a thick folder sitting on her desk. "This isn't $65 million anymore," she said. I felt my stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" She explained that the pattern in the accounts suggested the fraud had continued and grown beyond the amount I had originally discovered. "Based on what I'm seeing, we're probably closer to $71 million by now." I didn't know what to say. I had spent weeks thinking I was dealing with a terrible situation. Now I realized I had only seen part of it. Rosalind explained that I had two possible paths. The first was a whistleblower complaint with federal regulators. The second was a wrongful termination claim based on the timing of my report and firing. She warned me that neither would be quick. There could be months of waiting. There could be pressure. There could be attempts to challenge my evidence. I looked at the documents spread across her desk. For the first time, I wasn't just an employee who had been fired. I was someone who could actually do something. So I told her, "Let's do both." Filing the whistleblower complaint felt strangely ordinary. There was no dramatic courtroom. No investigators waiting outside. Just forms, documents, dates, explanations, and hundreds of pages of evidence. I submitted everything I had. Then came the waiting. Days passed. Then weeks. I started wondering if nothing would happen. But Rosalind kept reminding me that large investigations moved slowly. "Don't mistake silence for inaction," she told me. I tried to believe her. What I didn't know was that things inside the company were already beginning to change. The fraud wasn't my secret anymore. It was sitting in the hands of people who had the power to follow the money. And once they started looking, Grantham's carefully protected world would begin falling apart. 6 months after I was fired, I received a message from Marlowe. It was short. "Something is happening here." I stared at those 4 words for several seconds. Marlowe was still working inside the company. We had stayed in quiet contact after my termination, even though neither of us wanted to take unnecessary risks. She couldn't tell me everything. But she knew enough to understand what was happening. The company's outside auditors had started finding irregularities during their annual review. At first, nobody knew if it was connected to what I had reported. The auditors were simply seeing numbers that didn't make sense. Vendor payments were unusually high. Certain expenses didn't match normal business patterns. Some records didn't line up with the company's internal reports. The board couldn't ignore it anymore. They demanded a full internal investigation. And this time Grantham couldn't control it. The investigation was being overseen by the audit committee, which reported directly to the board. For the first time, someone was looking at the company's finances without asking Grantham for permission. Marlowe later told me that Sawyer was one of the first people questioned. That didn't surprise me. He had been responsible for overseeing some of the financial records connected to the vendors. What surprised me was how quickly everything changed after his interview. According to Marlowe, Sawyer lasted less than 2 days before agreeing to cooperate. He gave investigators information about 2 additional shell companies that hadn't yet been discovered. The money had allegedly been used to purchase real estate under a relative's name in another state. When Marlowe told me, I felt something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel happy. Not exactly. I felt relieved. For 6 months, I had lived with the fear that maybe nobody would ever believe me. Maybe the company would continue operating. Maybe Grantham would keep everything hidden. Maybe I would be remembered as the employee who made a false accusation and got fired because of it. But now investigators were finding the same things I had found. Only they were finding even more. I remember sitting quietly after Marlowe finished telling me everything. I thought about that Tuesday morning. The $2.3 million invoice. The first spreadsheet. The meeting with Grantham. The HR room. The security guard. The box waiting beside my desk. For months, I had wondered whether I had ruined my own life by speaking up. Now I understood something important. I hadn't created the problem. I had exposed it. And the deeper investigators looked, the more evidence they found. The first domino had finally fallen. And I knew Grantham couldn't stop the rest from coming down. 9 months after I was fired, Marlowe sent me another message. He's been placed on leave. I read it twice. Grantham, the man who had once sat behind that massive office desk and told me I was one of the company's most promising employees, was finally being removed from his position. But that wasn't the end. 2 weeks later, federal investigators arrived at the company headquarters with a search warrant. Marlo sent me one sentence that morning. It's really happening. I sat in my apartment staring at my phone. For months I had imagined this moment. I thought I would feel excited. Instead I felt strangely calm. I turned on the news. At first the story was local. Then it spread. Investigators were examining millions of dollars in questionable payments involving multiple vendors and accounts. The amount kept growing. $65 million. Then $70 million. Eventually, investigators traced nearly $74 million in total losses. I remember seeing Grantham's name on the screen and feeling my hands shake. Not because I was afraid of him anymore. Because I finally understood how close I had come to being erased. He had tried to make me look like the problem. He had fired me. He had taken away my income. He had allowed people to believe I was dishonest. But now investigators were following the money. And the money was leading straight back to him. Grantham was eventually indicted on multiple charges, including fraud and obstruction of justice. The obstruction charge was especially painful to read about because it was connected to his actions after I reported what I had discovered. My firing was no longer just an employment dispute. It had become part of the evidence. The company itself couldn't survive the damage. Customers left. Employees started resigning. The value of the business collapsed. Eventually, the company was sold for a fraction of what it had once been worth. People who had ignored me when I walked out with that box were suddenly losing their own jobs. I didn't celebrate that. Too many innocent employees were caught in the fallout. But I couldn't pretend I felt sorry for Grantham. His personal life collapsed too. His house eventually went into foreclosure. His wife filed for divorce during the investigation. And the man who once controlled everything was suddenly fighting to keep control of nothing. His trial ended with a sentence of 8 years behind bars. I thought I would feel satisfied when I heard the sentence. Yet I felt tired. Because justice hadn't erased what happened to me. It hadn't given me those months back. But it had proven one thing I desperately needed to know. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the problem. I had told the truth. And eventually the truth had caught up with him. My whistleblower claim was approved 14 months after I filed it. I won't share the exact amount I received, but I will tell you this. It changed my life. Not because the money made me rich. Because it gave me something I had lost the day I walked out of that company. Security. 4 months, I had been afraid every time my phone rang from an unknown number. I worried that another job opportunity would disappear. I worried about my future. Then slowly that fear started to fade. My wrongful termination case settled quietly several months before Grantham's trial ended. I didn't spend the money trying to prove anything to anyone. I used part of it to help my mother retire from the diner where she had worked for 11 years. That meant more to me than anything else. I still remember the look on her face when I told her she didn't have to keep working. She stared at me for a moment. Then she started crying. So did I. After everything that happened, giving my mother the chance to finally rest felt like the first truly good thing to come out of that nightmare. I eventually returned to finance. But I chose a much smaller company. A quieter place. There were no massive offices or complicated layers of management. On my first day, the owner sat down with me and reviewed the vendor process personally. Before I left his office, he said something I'll never forget. 4 eyes catch what 2 eyes miss. Then he added, I read what happened to you before I hired you. I didn't ask how he knew. Some things follow you whether you want them to or not. For once I didn't mind. Marlo and I still talk every week. She eventually left the company too. She told me that watching what happened to me gave her the courage to walk away from a job that had been quietly draining her for years. Sometimes we talk about that old office. Sometimes we laugh about things that once felt unbearable. And sometimes we just remind each other that leaving was worth it. For a long time I thought this story was about revenge. I don't anymore. Revenge would have meant spending my life waiting for Grantham to fall. Instead I learned that surviving was enough. I lost a job. I lost friends. I lost the sense of safety I once had. But I didn't lose myself. I told the truth when it was dangerous. I protected the evidence when nobody believed me. And when everything finally ended, I was still standing. Grantham lost his company, his freedom, and the life he had built on lies. I lost my place in his company. But I gained my life back. And honestly, I think I got the better ending. Would you have reported the fraud if you knew it could cost you your career? Tell me your answer and where you're watching from. If Hadley's story inspired you, subscribe for more powerful stories about truth, betrayal, and justice.